אנחנו מתחילים. שלום לכולם, שלום לכל מי שהגיע לכנס השנתי ה-15 של פורום MIT ליזמות, ותודה שבאתם לכאן. שלום למרצים הנכבדים. אנחנו מתחילים את הכנס הזה בשפה האנגלית. We will now switch to English. I would like to welcome our distinguished guests on stage and off stage and introduce the moderator of the first part of this program, Professor Shlomo Meital. Shlomo Meital served for 11 years as academic director of TIM, Technion Institute of Management. He is a co-founder of the Israeli chapter of the MIT Enterprise Forum, the first such chapter launched outside of North America. He taught for 20 summers in Professor Ed Roberts' Management of Technology MSc program at MIT. The Hebrew translation of his book, Innovation Management, will be published by the Hebrew University Press in March. Shlomo Meital, bevakasha.
Ela, thank you. Welcome, everybody, to the annual MIT Enterprise Forum of Israel conference. Ela, we did an event last year, if you recall, and we had 4 economists. This year we made a lot of progress, except for me, and I don't count. We have no economists. We're moving ahead. I'd like to call on Professor Moshe Tzviran, who is Vice Dean of the Faculty of Business here at Tel Aviv University, to bring greetings. Professor Tzviran.
Hi, good afternoon. I didn't know this is a situation. I could call some economists here. It's easy, just a couple of rows above. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everybody here. It seems that the Faculty of Management and the Rekanati Business School is probably the natural place in Israel for this type of conference, and actually Israel seems to be the natural place to hold such a conference on entrepreneurship and innovation. I'm saying those words about Tel Aviv University and the Faculty of Management because we realize that in addition to the typical MBA programs, we should lead towards management of technology, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And as a matter of fact, we have launched a program, an MBA program in this field just this year, and it kind of converges to an apology that I need to carry, which is unfortunately I'll not be able to be here at the conference in 5 minutes from now because I have to move and try to make a speech to new students that are coming to our new program of technology management and innovation. So it's a kind of a loop of bringing I hope, the new talents of maybe the year 2020 or a bit earlier or later, bringing the new talents to the technology arena in Israel. But meanwhile, I do hope that you are going to have a very fruitful conference, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon and, well, it's getting dark, afternoon and evening. So thank you very much for coming and enjoy the evening. Thank you, Shlomo.
Thank you, Professor Tzviran. Before I introduce the program and introduce our speakers, Ela, this is a very serious gathering. Is it okay to tell a joke? It's okay. All right. But it has a point. This joke, by the way, is from a book called Startup Nation. How many of you have heard of it or perhaps read it? Worthwhile, worth reading. Startup Nation, about Israeli innovation. So 4 guys are standing on a street corner, an American, a Russian, a Chinese, and an Israeli. A reporter comes up to the group and he says, excuse me, what's your opinion on the meat shortage? The American says, what's a shortage? The Russian says, what's meat? The Chinese says, what's an opinion? The Israeli says, what's excuse me? The point of the story is that Israeli innovation in part stems from Israeli chutzpah. Professor Murray, you know that word? You know that word well. The willingness to break rules and not to understand what excuse me means. This conference is about success factors in high-tech entrepreneurship, and perhaps one of those factors is indeed the Israeli chutzpah that doesn't know what excuse me means. So we have a good program for you, built by Ella and her team. The first half will be in English, the second half after the break in Hebrew. The first half is about the macro level, the macro environment of high-tech entrepreneurship. The second half is on the micro, at the level of the entrepreneur and the firm. We have two speakers and then a panel discussion in this first half. The first speaker will be Professor Fiona Murray from MIT Sloan School of Management. I'll introduce her in a moment. She'll be speaking about the role of university in successful high-technology entrepreneurship, education, and ideas. Our second speaker is Professor Yaakov Ziv of the Technion, and he'll be speaking about science policy and R&D infrastructures, the Israeli perspective. So let me introduce Professor Fiona Murray, who has been gracious enough to agree to come and speak, using part of her vacation to do so. As I mentioned, she's an associate professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. Please, in your booklets or your pamphlets, you can find biographies of all our panelists and all our speakers. I won't repeat what's in that material, but I just do want to mention one additional fact about Professor Murray. She works with a range of firms designing global organizations that are both commercially successful and at the forefront of science. By the way, she has a bachelor's degree in science. These firms seek to leverage the ideas of a wide range of internal scientists as well as external innovators accessed through traditional research contracts, as well as something called open innovation mechanisms. And she focuses on relationships that span the public and private sectors. She's very interested in new organizational arrangements for commercializing science, including public-private partnerships and other. This is an issue that's vast importance here in Israel, and that will be discussed in this panel in trying to find new ways and better ways to commercialize some of the basic science work that is done in universities. Professor Murray, thanks a lot for coming. Please. Do you rather use the portable one?
It'll make it easier.
Yeah. Put it close to you. Okay. 30 minutes.
All right, well, I hope everybody can hear me. If you can't in the back, please wave. Can you hear me? No? You need me to speak up? All right. You want, well, I've got two, so I'm not quite sure which one is going to be the most effective. So let me, is that better? All right, you can continue to bother me. I'd rather you tell me to speak louder than go to sleep, okay? So, all right, so first let me say thank you for the invitation. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. And thank you very much, Soma, for your very kind introduction. I also want to say how much I appreciate all the very wonderful work that Ayla has done in organizing this event. I only hope I can take her home with me to help me organize some of the things that we have at MIT, because this is really wonderful. And I do also want to thank some of my family members who are here, who have taken great care of me and the rest of my family during my time here, which it's very nice. It's particularly nice for me to visit Israel because I have actually a very large number of Israeli students in many of my classes at MIT. I have Israeli students on the MBA program from the engineering school, and they certainly display a fair amount of the chutzpah that you talked about. Sometimes that means they interrupt a good deal during class and they ask some very hard and interesting questions, and I would encourage you to do the same. I'm happy to be interrupted. I'm quite used to that style. I'm also happy to say that many of them have come back to Israel, which is obviously very good for the economy here. I've recently had the opportunity to work with a company called UTest, which is a company started by some Israelis. It's actually based in Boston, which has a very interesting model of doing distributed software testing, which I think is a particularly interesting example of the kinds of entrepreneurship that we might talk about. But what I wanted to do today is really speak about the role of the university in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And by entrepreneurial ecosystem, I mean the institutional arrangements, formal and informal, that bring together ideas, people, and money. Now, I notice the MIT Enterprise Forum says bringing together ideas, technology, and people. I guess I'd like to see the money part in there as well, because in entrepreneurship, unfortunately, we need that too. The ecosystem is a place where we make sure we have all those three key ingredients, and we bring them together to be able to create and grow new companies. And the grow part, I think, is particularly important, not just to create companies. And while the university is not sufficient to have a successful entrepreneurial ecosystem for successful growth, I think without the university, it's very difficult to do it effectively. And frankly, I think that there are very few examples of successful entrepreneurial ecosystems which do not have at their core one or more very engaged universities that are open and part of the entrepreneurial community. So closed universities that don't talk to the outside world are not very helpful in this regard. And so I want to talk about that role because I think it's quite controversial and there's something we can learn. The reason I'm going to talk about MIT is not because I think we're the best, nor because we're the worst, but rather we have a long history of trying to participate in the entrepreneurial ecosystem around us. We are not shy about that, and we're quite self-aware. And so there have been a number of recent studies and analyses that I'll talk about that talk a little bit about this sort of activity. And so I hope that that will be useful as part of our conversation. Now, before I jump into my discussion of MIT, I want to put my analysis into context. Now, for me, as some of you might be able to tell, although I live in the United States, I'm actually originally from England. And so for me, putting something into context means having to take you back to the 17th century. And I'm actually not going to say excuse me for doing that, but rather say this is a good part of educating ourselves, that the challenges we face identifying the right role of the university are not new challenges. This is not a new problem. This is not a new debate. But it's still a debate of central importance. And so if we go back to the 17th century, we go back basically in Britain at least to the Enlightenment and the founding of the Royal Society. And what was that? That was a place where scientists and tinkerers, entrepreneurs and inventors could come together, and as they said, they could improve the knowledge of natural things and useful things, useful arts, manufactures, mechanic practices, engines, and inventions by experiments. What did they mean by this? They actually meant doing science, engaging in useful things, but useful was an important part of that. And so originally, when we thought about science and intellectual endeavors, we thought about usefulness. That was true several hundred years later. When you look in the 19th century, you see a very tight but informal relationship between universities and industry. And what were those universities doing? Well, if we look in the United States, they were establishing industry-relevant disciplines. I think a good example of that would be chemical engineering. Much of the development of chemical engineering was really there to help build the foundations of the chemical industry. They were focused on education, educating scientists for industrial research labs and for entrepreneurship. And they were there to generate ideas. Mostly, though, those ideas got out into the economy through individual faculty members giving advice, serving as consultants, exchanging views. And so you go back to the late 19th century and you find academics talking to companies, being consultants. Again, this is not a new challenge. And you see this in the US with places like the University of Delaware, who had an intimate relationship with DuPont, the University of North Carolina, who were deeply engaged in science around tobacco processing, MIT's role in establishing chemical engineering education. If you look over the sort of north from here to Germany and the UK, the universities played a great role in founding the chemical industry, and many of the great chemistry departments, of which I received my undergraduate degree in the UK, were intimately involved in industrial development. Now, if you then move a few years later, decades later, you begin to see what can really only be described as a sort of decoupling, a separation between universities and industry, and the emergence of this expression, the ivory tower. The ivory tower was not something that we first saw when we started to think about science. The ivory tower is really a conception that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in Europe, and you end up with scientists basically sitting around, and this would be the question, right, what great scientific mystery cries for my attention today? Not what useful problem should I be solving today, not what's useful and interesting, but rather, let me just be very dissociated from usefulness. And so this is a caricature of academia, but nevertheless, I think a fairly true statement as academia tried to separate itself from industry and see itself as this very distinct, special, enclosed place, far from the kind of dirty business of industry and money-making. And really that decoupling is something that I think we struggle with today, because the legacy of the ivory tower is really one that we have to deal with to try to understand the right relationship between academia and industry, the right role that the university should have in this entrepreneurial ecosystem. So if we turn back again to the United States, we actually find in post-World War II that there's some reaffirmation of the role of science and the university in the economy and in economic growth. And this was reaffirmed by somebody called Vannevar Bush, another MIT alum, who basically says, look, advances in science when put to practical use mean more jobs, higher wages, shorter hours. So a really tight coupling that he sees between what scientists should be doing and economic growth, which is a continuous theme then in the work of a number of economists who really think about, they increasingly identify the role of science and technical change in economic growth. However, the way that he conceptualizes this is not really in a tight relationship, but rather as a commitment to basic scientific research and a large amount of funding from the National Science Foundation, from the national kind of government into science. But organizationally, this is kind of done in a very separate sort of way. And one way to visualize that is to say, look, we're going to have universities do this basic research, and they're going to do this work for fun, for freedom, for love of knowledge. And then we're going to have companies who do useful applied stuff, and they're going to do it because they want to work for money and they want to be useful. And we're going to see this world as two really very separate places. And frankly, we're not going to think about how all the investment in one, all the investment in science and basic knowledge, in any way flows into industry. We really aren't going to even answer that question. It's an unclear boundary. If you had to describe it, and if you force somebody to articulate it, you sort of assume that companies are out there waiting to catch great ideas as they fall out of the university. I think that's the mental image, as the companies are running around trying to catch the ball of the great idea. And that's an idea that was pervasive through the 1950s, 1960s, a very kind of linear model that if we build investment in basic science, somehow something good will happen for the economy. Now, by the late 70s, there was a great deal of impatience on the part of the federal government in the United States. This sort of impatience, I think, came a little later to some of the European countries, to the United Kingdom, but it's been followed by a similar impatience around the world. Now, what did that mean? Well, it meant in the United States, at least, congressional debates, that if you follow the congressional text and so on, that really says, look, what are we getting for our money? We're spending millions of dollars, billions of dollars every year in these universities. What are we getting for our money? What do we have to show for ourselves? There are a number of studies that suggested that a small percent of university ideas were used by companies. Now, we could kind of do an academic exercise and take apart those studies. They're actually not very well done, but nevertheless, the underlying point is clear. There's a lot of impatience, and we don't believe that fuzzy boundary between industry and academia was working very well. There was a lot of pressure then on funding, and in particular, there was a lot of institutional confusion over the ownership of the ideas that were being generated in the university. In particular, if you had government money and you came up with a new idea and you wanted to file a patent, intellectual property on that idea, nobody could quite decide who owned that patent. Effectively, the government owned the patent. And so if you wanted to use the patent, you had to get permission from the federal government that your university could take title and could manage it. And that was very complicated. And so basically what happened was that there was a commitment made to deal with this problem through something called the Bayh-Dole Act. And so the government tried to reconceptualize the university as a source of new ideas and newly educated people, an engine for the economy, but the precise legislation dealt with this mostly in terms of intellectual property. And I think that's been the focus for the role of the university in entrepreneurship from that point forward. And I would argue that that focus is a narrow one and probably an incorrect way of thinking about things. So we have in 1980 the Bayh-Dole Act, which basically puts ownership of patents into the hands of universities. It places a burden on universities to commercialize those through structured licensing arrangements and requires the university to favor small entrepreneurial firms in their licensing. And what do we get? this graph shows the number of technology transfer programs in American universities from the early 1970s. Now, MIT has had a program of this type since long before the Bayh-Dole Act, but what you see is universities around the country setting up technology transfer offices, and I know you have one of those here in Tel Aviv, you have them in Technion. Most universities now don't feel like they're a real university unless they have one of these entities. Now, this is what the government did. What they really were hoping for was this. What they really wanted is to say, let's not just have the universities doing basic stuff because they like fun and interesting ideas, the sort of pure science, and then the industry doing the stuff in the bottom right-hand side, sort of Edisonian applied research. We want something in that top right-hand box, and no management talk would be complete without a 2x2 matrix. And it's always the right place to be in these matrices, as those of you who've done an MBA know, is to be in the top right-hand side. The top right-hand side here is what we call Pasteur's quadrant. That is basically science with a useful focus. So what the government really wanted was for universities to do great science that responded to and was relevant to industry's needs. In my view, what they got instead, because of the way that they constructed the problem, was basically this. So this says, class, today's lesson on sharing has been cancelled. It will be replaced by a lesson called Protecting Intellectual Property. So, in my view, what they really wanted was a coupling between the problems of great science and the problems of industry. What they actually got was an obsession with patents and with intellectual property. And so, for the rest of my time, I want to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the issues with that, and a kind of reconceptualization of the university as being as much about people as it is about ideas, and about the way universities should, in fact, think about their ideas way beyond just a pure kind of narrow patenting view. So, the universities indeed responded. I mean, this is a case in which you get what you measure, you get what you pay for. The universities were incentivized to respond to the Bayh-Dole Act, and you get this incredible uptick in university patenting. So the black bars are the numbers of inventions that is disclosed by US universities, and the yellow bars are just the number of patents that get filed by American universities. And by the mid-2000s, what do you get? You get about 10,000 patents granted each year to US universities on about $30 billion in research funding. That's about $3 million a patent. Right? It's not clear whether we think that's a high number or a low number. It simply shows you a real shift in focus of these universities. It's not that these universities have stopped publishing, and I think that's an important point to make. And a lot of my research has been to sort of document that academics are not shifting away from publishing towards patenting. You can do both. And the efficient academic writes a publication manuscript, and just before they send it to Science or Nature, they send it off to the patent lawyer. Right? And so this is how this process actually works. But nevertheless, the legislation is constructed around patents, and so patents you get. Academics actually do respond to incentives and to kind of rules and regulations. Now, increasingly, and in my view, I think, it's about time that there's a strong recognition that patenting and this sort of licensing obsession doesn't actually help us as much as we thought it would solve the problem of the university having a real and deep impact on the economy. In particular, this role of patenting and licensing was cast, certainly in Europe, in the UK for sure, and I think in the United States, as this idea that the university would get all these patents, those would then be licensed to companies. In return, companies would pay the university royalties, and that those royalties would become the third leg of the funding for the university. You'd have research funding, funding from educational fees, and you'd have this third leg of a stool, which would be licensing revenue. It turns out that that would be a very uncomfortable stool to sit on, because it would be very skewed. The licensing is really very small. Across the United States, it provides less than 5% of the total university research expenditure. Now, MIT is in fact among the most successful licensing operations among United States universities. But just to put this into perspective, in 2006 we received, and I say only $30 million in licensing revenues. But let me put that in context. That's on an annual research base of about $1 billion. So MIT has about $1 billion that comes in every year, 95% of that from the federal government, and only $30 million comes in from licensing. And so even at an extraordinarily successful licensing operation, this is about the percent that we can deal with. That doesn't make for a very comfortable role of licensing as a new revenue source for the university. And again, just to put this into, just to give you the real numbers, so about $1 billion, and remember that this is not just 2006, we have had that every year for the last however many decades, throws off about 500 invention disclosures, about 300 patents, about 120 licenses, about 23 startups created. That's about one for every $50 million in annual funding, and a licensing office of about 15 professionals. Now, as a university, we see this as actually quite important part of what we do, but for reasons that are very different from the let's use the licensing office to generate revenue and generate funding. And certainly if you look across the board of academic institutions operating at different scales, you see that even in Massachusetts, only 15 of the 14 institutions that we have a lot of information on make more than $1 million per year from their licensing revenue. Across the country, only quite a small fraction actually break even in their licensing operation. And what you see is a hugely skewed distribution. So it's normally one license gives you all the money. The rest of them have a useful impact on industry but don't generate revenues back from the university. It's normally a single blockbuster drug that you happen to have invented in one of your labs. And so there's really a sense that this is not a useful way to conceptualize the role of the university. And so this licensing-focused operation has been very sharply criticized, actually, by the federal government, by industry, who increasingly find the universities very difficult to deal with, very kind of picky about the contracts and the contractual terms, and in fact by the academics themselves, who don't find this a pleasant way of having their ideas have impact. And so MIT, at least, has tried to kind of spearhead a reorientation of the role of the university towards the university as a locus of ideas and people. So again, to come back to what the Enterprise Forum does, as a place that tries to help generate ideas, but people, to think about the fact that our most powerful impact on the economy is through the people we train, and as a place that helps bring together this ecosystem that brings together the people, the ideas, and the money, and helps create the connections among them. And we think that we can play a very powerful role in that if we get our focus away from this pure licensing kind of focus. And so I was going to spend the rest of my time just talking a little bit about what that looks like inside MIT. Now, from the point of view of ideas, this means reconceptualizing the role of the licensing office, not to maximize licensing revenue, but instead to maximize the impact on the commercial world that the ideas that we have actually might have. That might mean creating a license that allows you to actually push these ideas out, say, to a developing country, to reserve rights to use for, say, some developing country project, as well as a more commercially oriented project. It may mean non-exclusive licensing. It can sometimes mean exclusive licensing. It's a much richer way of thinking about it. For the faculty, this means thinking about patenting and commercialization as a way to have impact, keep their students happy, create jobs, and occasionally get rich. I recently did some work on this around the life science entrepreneurship. And if you actually look across our experiences in life science startups, even those that do an IPO, if you actually think about the probability, once you've started a biotech company, of actually doing a public offering, it's only about 1 in 100 faculty members that actually become very wealthy through this activity. This is not a very surefire way of making money. Now, when you do, you get very rich and you have a nice car and everyone on campus notices your car because nobody else has a nice one. But it's really not a way of trying to for sure get rich, but it is a way of having impact with a quite high level of certainty. And that's a much different view that faculty might have of this whole process. For the university, it means maximizing impact, not revenues. And for the licensing office, this means not necessarily being rewarded on the number of licenses, but rather on efficiently executing licenses so that industry and business can do its job well. To try to license in a way that allows for better commercial outcomes, that bundles intellectual property, and that avoids some of the mistakes of the 90s, of which I've written at excruciating length. I think you said you read some of my papers. I'm sorry for that. They're very long, mostly. There's a long history of the licensing of this mouse in the bottom right. This is the oncomouse. It's a mouse genetically engineered to have cancer, which is very useful in drug discovery. There's a long history of universities, Harvard in particular, licensing this to DuPont, who then imposed very stringent sub-licensing requirements on academia and companies. And in doing so, you can really document very clearly had actually a dampening effect on follow-on innovation and commercialization. That's also true in stem cells in the United States, which has actually operated, in some of my work at least, we can document much to the benefit of the research around stem cells in Israel and some other countries. But in the United States, the licensing structures have been very problematic. And so we're trying to think about licensing as enabling, not kind of locking up our ideas. So let me just give you a quick sense of how this might work. This is probably very familiar to many of you. The most recent example that we like to talk about, we always have a favorite example, which is our most recent successful company. And our favorite company at the moment is A123. This is a company recently IPO'd, founded from Yetmin Chang's lab in material science, this new lithium-ion battery cathode material. It was patented by MIT, which then exclusively licensed it to the company with a minimum guaranteed payment of $50,000 per year once the company had any kind of earnings, and then single-digit equity to the university. And single digits, I think, is what's probably unusual, but very typical of MIT. So we never basically take more than single-digit equity, and the benefits of that equity are shared a third among faculty, departments, and the main university. And that equity is sold on IPO, and the university actually does not, in our case, invest in the companies. The founding faculty, of course, can gain additional founders' equity depending on their role in the company, but this is not through the university. This is founders' equity that they would take as a role as founder. Perhaps the most interesting and important point, though, here is not the licensing agreement, but rather that the co-founders and indeed several of the co-investors were MIT alumni. One of the alumni, Rick Fulop, who's an alumni of the Sloan School, was, as he is wont to do, wandering the corridors of MIT looking for good ideas. Came across this lab. He'd not worked with Professor Chang before, and started a conversation about investing in these new ideas. He'd had several actually unsuccessful entrepreneurial ventures behind him. This one is a successful one, but it speaks to the role of the alumni in entrepreneurship in the ecosystem. And so I just want to finish with a little bit of an insight into what our alumni do for us as the university. My colleague Ed Roberts, who Professor Maitel mentioned, who spent his entire career since the age of 17 at MIT, did an alumni study recently. We have over 100,000 living alumni. It's actually, when you think about it, not actually an enormous number. They surveyed them in 2003. Probably some of you here may have received the survey. There were 43,000 respondents, of whom at least 8,000 had founded at least one company. Now that means that between, 8% and 25% are entrepreneurs. That's actually a high number. They are overrepresented in entrepreneurship. They founded about 25,000 companies. That's a conservative estimate because we're not counting those that have subsequently been sold, like DEC, or those like HP, where the alumni founder is actually no longer with us. 25% of those companies are in Massachusetts. So even individuals who are from other countries have often stayed in Massachusetts to found their companies. And how many jobs have they created? Well, if you look, about 5% of the companies have created about 90% of the employment, and that's employment on the order of about 3.3 million employees, so 3.3 million jobs. So our alumni have done good work for us. And that, let's just compare it to the number of actual spin-out companies. There are about 500 spin-out companies. Some of them have gone on to be very successful. But the alumni contribution to the regional economy and to the entrepreneurial ecosystem much dominates the direct tech transfer. And so what that does is remind us that we have to focus not just on ideas, but on people. And just to tell you, these people come from a variety of backgrounds. They're not just management school students. In the 1990s, only 15% of the companies are from those with management degrees. More than 20% have degrees in electrical engineering and computer science, about 5% in life sciences. And so our alumni from across the university are very important. And they think the university is important in their entrepreneurial activities. But look at the 1990s, what do they say? 50% of them say it's the entrepreneurial network. 30% say it's our business plan competition. 12% say it's the entrepreneurship center. As the recent associate director of that center, I'm hoping to increase that number. Only about 10% say it's technology licensing. And so it really is the fact that the university is a place that brings together people and ideas, not just the ideas part that really matters. And so we try to amplify what we see as this internal entrepreneurial ecosystem. And this is a new picture that we put together that tries to make sense of the many things we do within the university to try to help this. It's organized by stage of entrepreneurship. And as you'll see, and the other people who look at this say, you know, the Entrepreneurship Center thinks it does everything. We believe that's true. We certainly educate the students to think about all the stages of business formation and growth. But the venture mentoring service is very important, the Deshpande Center, the licensing office, are all parts of this complicated ecosystem. Just to give you an example of mentoring, we have 3 different mentoring programs in the university for would-be entrepreneurs. And the center itself takes the education piece very seriously. We have these courses built on what we call mens and manners. That's MIT's motto, mind and hand. What that means is that I'm often in the classroom together with somebody like Jonathan Fleming, who's a local life science venture capitalist and longtime entrepreneur. So he and I might teach together. We have local entrepreneurs who actually teach their own classes. So we really have deep engagement of the entrepreneurial community with our students through mentoring. They serve as catalysts on projects and so on, as well as the more traditional classes. We do a whole bunch of other things. And then let me just finish by telling you something that I do, which I like particularly, so I'm going to steal an extra minute to tell you, which is a class that I think epitomizes this idea of the role that we can play in this ecosystem. I teach a class called iTeams, which basically is joint between the management school and the engineering school. We take real technology projects going on in MIT labs, and we match them up with teams of students from engineering and from the management school. They have the faculty advisor, myself, but also a catalyst, somebody from the outside entrepreneurial community who works with them on a weekly basis, and the project faculty member. And their goal is to evaluate the commercial potential of these ideas. So the idea is that in the short term, they develop a commercial plan. In the long term, they build a lasting network and expertise. And in the short time we've done this, which is only 3 semesters, we've already seen 3 spin-out companies kind of begin with real student participation. And we think that this is a very important way of bringing ideas and people and the community together. And so I think, just to conclude, clearly, from an ideas point of view, we have to focus on encouraging new enterprises, not on the tight control of our ideas. From the people point of view, we need to educate our students to really be engaged, and we need to educate them with this rich interplay of faculty and entrepreneurs. We need to engage alumni. If money is limited, as it often is, the university may need to do things about that. But most importantly, we need to create ties in that ecosystem. And so that's very much how we conceive of our role. And so I'm happy to have the chance to share these ideas with you. I want to thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'd be happy at the end to answer any questions. So.
Thank you, Professor Murray. Fiona, brief comment. Fiona, you mentioned mens et manus, the MIT motto, which is actively used today. MIT was founded in 1865, 144 years ago, by a man named William Barton Rogers. And he founded MIT in a grubby industrial part of Cambridge, in a grubby old building. And he had a vision. And the vision was, of course, in Latin, as was customary in those days. Mens et manus, mind and hand. Do great, excellent, basic research in science, but at the same time find ways to make it of practical use to humanity. And that vision has driven MIT for 144 years, and it's as powerful today as it ever was. Great example of a powerful vision. Our next speaker is Professor Jacob Zeev. Professor Zeev is head of the Forum for National R&D Infrastructure, and has a very unusual career path. Professor Ziv, after graduating from the Technion as an electrical engineer, worked in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He then went to MIT, good school, for his doctorate. And while doing his MIT, worked in industrial R&D. He later worked for the Ministry of Defense. He spent time at Bell Labs and then joined Technion full-time only in 1970. Became Dean of Electrical Engineering in 1974. And what's amazing, the thing he's known for best, he has many accomplishments, the Ziv-Lempel data compression algorithm, which succeeds in compressing data by half, saving all that storage space without losing any information. A revolutionary algorithm, roughly, I think, comparable to perhaps the Google algorithm by Sergey Brin and Larry Page. It seems to have developed that algorithm while you were Dean of the Electrical Engineering faculty, working with Professor Lempel, which is quite amazing. A career path coming from industrial R&D and military R&D toward academic life. And Professor Ziv is going to speak to us about the science policy and R&D infrastructure, the Israeli perspective. Professor Ziv.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. I just mentioned to Fioria that I am one of the 100,000 living MIT graduates. And I was also involved early in my career with a startup, one of the early startups in Israel, Tellem. Okay, so I fit the statistics. I'm going to talk about policy, but before talking about it, the question is, do we need a national policy at all? It's well known that Israel is doing very well scientifically. It's well known for its technological achievements. If you don't believe me, just listen to our president. Every prime minister keeps saying that, but it's true. So if all this happen, and I must say, as I will say later, mention later, all this happened without really having any general national policy. Some people might say that it happened not despite of, but because of the fact that there was no really national effort to regulate all this process. But if this is the case, where do I push Nina? Oh, right here. Yes. So despite of the fact that what happening here is more like a random walk management of a very complicated process, perhaps with some chutzpah, as you said, why should we consider to look at it again and ask ourselves whether we do need some national policy on certain issues? Well, even when we look back, actually the random walk was not really random, because there were three major developments which on the micromanagement level were well managed. The first was the fact that Israel managed to establish a very successful higher education system, an independent one, less now. And secondly, in parallel to that, in the Israeli Academy of Science established the National Science Foundation, which, just to give you some numbers, in 1980 it was $500,000. And since then, that was a government decision to start two two foundations, one to support basic research, the other one for applied research. But that was it. The $500,000 which was dedicated to practical or applied research disappeared, but the university system itself took it upon itself from its own budget to slowly grow the National Science Foundation, and from $500,000 in 1980, it's now closer to $60 million per year. So this was a very major step towards supporting basic research in the universities. The other one was, of course, capital investment, huge capital investment in defense and agricultural R&D, which we still benefit from today. And the third one was actually the establishment of the Chief Scientist Office with its policy to support industrial research, sometimes combined with academic research. And also, to a much smaller extent, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Science supported some of it too. So, if Israel has done so well, why should we do something else now and try to perhaps coordinate national R&D? Well, the ground rules have been changed. Something is happening now during the last, not now, during the last at least 15 years or 10 years. For some areas, we need massive investments. For example, even investment which what seems to be basic research, but it's also important to apply. For example, building a synchrotron radiation actually facility is something which is very important to research in chemistry, in physics, in medicine, and so forth. Is a matter of a few $100 million, not to take into account the running costs. And the only way to achieve it is to join other countries, not even universities, other countries in that effort. The same applies to areas like biotechnology and the nanotechnology and so forth. They all call for huge investments. Now, since the ground rules have been changed, if you don't look for ways to get those massive investments, you simply fall behind, and there is no way back. So what do we do? Well, aside from the fact that you must find ways to find those sources for the massive investment, a crucial problem is the one which was touched in the first lecture, the relations between universities and the industry. This is a very crucial point. It's probably the main topic of this session, this meeting today, and this is why I decided to join it actually. It's important, but there are very important very difficult not important, stumbling blocks and dangers. The IP issue was very beautifully represented beforehand, and let me just mention to you that Zohar and myself happened to serve on a committee which was appointed by the Council of Higher Education. We actually adapted to change the IP policy of the universities here, especially in the IT area, and actually adopt the MIT model. The result was that the report was fully adopted in principle, which means that nothing happened. And but it's there. I mean, we are aware of what's going on in MIT, but we are convinced, at least the two of us, convinced that this is the way to go. But this is a very important stumbling block. And there's a similar, I mean, it's perhaps even more important when it comes to the biomedical industry. I mean, it's almost impossible to get a doctor in a hospital to do something in this area. And if there's one guy who invented some biological glue nowadays, he's represented as being a criminal of trying to, to steal some ideas from his hospital and sell it for nothing. So, but I'm not going to expand on that. I'm sure that we'll have more time in the round table discussion later on. The other one, of course, it is the real danger. I mean, there is a fear in the universities that being involved in more applied problems might result in short-term horizons in research. And, but this can be avoided. And the third one is, again, as mentioned earlier, the dream of the university to make a lot of money of the IP, from IP, which is both impractical, as we have heard, and also dangerous, because not only does the university won't make a lot of money out of it, on the average. In some areas it's different, but it might transmit a message, convey a message to the government that they don't have to worry about supporting research in the universities. Let the universities and the industry worry about it. Why should we worry about it? So this is very dangerous and complicated, but nevertheless, this doesn't mean that we should not encourage the interrelation between the universities and the industry. So how do we proceed? Well, let me tell you what's happening here now in Israel. I'm not sure that all of you know. There are two problems. One is on the level of infrastructure, huge infrastructure projects. How do you deal with huge projects like nanotechnology or getting involved, getting a partner in a synchrotron radiation facility in CERN and so forth? The other one has to do with policy. I mean, how do you propose to the government, if they want a policy, that indicates as to whether how much money will be spent on nano as compared to bio? I mean, and what are the missing areas? Perhaps we should do something else. So I'm going to separate my talk into these two issues. The first one is something that I would like to tell you about, which is going on now. It's a very practical, down-to-earth solution to the problem of, not full solution, to the problem of getting huge infrastructure funded and running. There was an initiative which was taken by the way, by the Israeli Academy of Science about 12 years ago, and which is the following. Huge projects are not started by government agencies by either one of two reasons. First of all, it's too costly, and secondly, and it is as important, why should I do it? The other guy should do it. If it's if it's some research facility, let the University Grants Committee support it. And on the other hand, if it's applied, why should the university worry about it? Let the chief scientists worry about it, and so forth. So how do you solve it? Well, the idea was to take all the chief supporters of R&D in Israel together, get them together in an informal form, and the idea was that if the members of this forum agree on a project which is very essential, infrastructure project which is very essential to Israel, the idea was not to go to the government to ask for extra money, but to share the resources of all the members together and move ahead. and it's voluntary. This model works in Israel. I'm not sure about other countries. The forum consists, by the way, of the chief scientist of the Ministry of Industry, the chairman of VATAD, the University Grants Committee, MAFAT, the Ministry of Defense, the Director General of the Ministry of Science, and the Treasury. The Treasury liked the idea of sharing resources, of course, but, I mean, and he was he was encouraging this process, but in order to let him become a member, the condition, and it is being satisfied, fulfilled until today, that once a project is approved, they cover 15% of the cost. And somehow it's running for the last 12 years. There's one other country which has a similar model with one simple difference. The country is Finland, and the only difference is that this committee is not chaired by a retired professor on a voluntary basis like me, but by the Prime Minister of Finland. But the model, the voluntary model, really fits Israel because of social reasons that I'm not going to go into now. But anyhow, what this form, it's called Tellem, and the project that we covered until now, I'll just mention it quickly. I mean, these are the general ideas, and the largest project of Tellem until now was the initiative in nanotechnology. Before that, there were a few other projects like becoming partners in the European facilities, synchronization facility. There was a project in second generation internet. Now we don't need it. By the way, again, Zohar was the chairing the committee that checked the idea and brought it before Tellem for final approval. There were a few other projects I'm not going to talk about. Altogether, until now, the total expenditure was around 1.3 billion shekels. But the largest project till now was the Israeli initiative in nanotechnology, and I would like to talk a little bit like that because what emerges from that is a nice model that I think can be adapted for future such. Okay, sure. And so that was the mission, and those are the general ideas of what we wanted to achieve. I'll go through this quickly. And the first step was actually to start programs in those 6 universities. And by the way, the money is not evenly distributed among the universities. There is an international committee which checks the program periodically, and it does change the money allocation according to performance, which is important. But I want to mention the model. The model is how do you raise, I mean, the total investment was around $232 million in 5 years. How do you raise that much money? Well, the idea was to establish a triangular model where the government gives 1/3, the universities itself, out of their own running budget, gives the other third, and the last third part was coming from donation via the universities. I mean, for the donors, it was sort of a very tempting matching. I mean, 2/3 for 1/3. So it worked very well. And So this is the idea, as you can see. Now, what happened? I mean, first of all, let me see what a survey which was taken in 2007 shows. Well, you can see the data, and this is another table which shows you what happened during since this project started. By the way, Tellem ended its participation, and now it's up for INI to continue with the triangular model, except that I must say that the way to run it in the same model depends very heavily on perhaps replacing the donors model, which doesn't exist now, after what happened with Madoff and all these guys, and replace the donors part by perhaps private investment, investment funds and so forth. But the government should still play its part, and the universities as well. Okay, so this is what I just mentioned to you. And the other thing is I didn't talk about policy. These are just projects that we deal with. And the point is that if you decide to run a project, maybe it's too late. I mean, if everybody agrees that it's needed, maybe, I mean, it was needed 10 years ago and nobody noticed it. For this, you need a long-range strategic look, and hopefully this will be done one day by the recently established council, R&D council, National R&D Council. It was, the law was passed in 2002, but we have some problem with it too. I mean, some of the, in 3 words, the government does not let go. I mean, it was supposed to be an independent entity, and that was the law. Then the law was changed again, and now it's caught between offices, government offices, and so forth. But hopefully, I mean, one day we'll have it running and running well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziv, for your interesting address. Now, we are going to have a panel discussion. Our 2 speakers will remain as part of the panel, and we'll add 2 speakers. I'd like to ask Shimon Ekhoiz and Zohar Zisapel to please join us on the stage. And let me give a brief introduction to Shimon and Zohar, although most of you are highly familiar with them. First, let's begin with Zohar Zisapel. So Ella asked me to mention that the RAD companies that Zohar has founded is a national supporter of the MIT Enterprise Forum, and Effie Wachtel, who is president and CEO of RAD Data, is an MIT Forum vice chairman, and Shimon Ekhoiz is also a member of the MIT Enterprise Forum board. So we thank you both very much indeed. Brief introduction. You can read the bios of Zohar and Shimon in your brochures that you received. A couple of quick points about Zohar. He founded the RAD group of companies. 5 of the RAD group companies are listed on NASDAQ, including RadVision, Ceragon, Radware, Radcom, and Silicom. He spent 12 years doing R&D in the Israel Defense Forces before becoming an entrepreneur. In fact, this is a common denominator between Zohar and Shimon. They both came to entrepreneurship not as 25-year-olds, but as seasoned veterans with extensive experience in doing R&D. Zohar flies economy, and he wears jeans, and is very informal. And his companies export $850 million worth every year here in Israel. Shimon, I don't know if you remember, you spoke at the Technion about 15 years ago to our entrepreneurship class, and we asked you to please talk about your secret in being a successful entrepreneur. And you revealed your secret, and it had to do with gray hair. So Shimon was an engineer working at Rafael, the Weapons Development Authority, for many years, and retired, I think, at age 55. And at age 55 became an entrepreneur. Not a usual career path. Okay, sorry. But it's a good story anyway. And what you mentioned was, because you started a bit late in the entrepreneurship game, you had to come to market quickly with a product that met a real need. You had to do it efficiently and quickly, and you didn't have a lot of time for fooling around or making big mistakes. And that practical feet-on-the-ground approach, I think, has been part of your success, and it's amazing because you've started personally, funded and started 9 companies, and they all have the same hallmark: practical device or approach that meets a real need, using relatively little money to get to the market quickly, even though it's in the area of medical devices and you have to go through the FDA hoops in order to get to market. So we thank both Zohar and Shimon for joining our panel. And I'd now like to open the discussion to questions from the audience. Please make your question short, punchy, and to the point. And if you will, please use the microphone so that we can all hear your question. Please, could you pass the microphone?
Graham Jackson, University of Haifa. I would like to ask the members of the panel whether they think there should be national priorities established for R&D in Israel, and if so, how do you think those priorities should be established? According to which criteria?
Panelists? Professor Ziv, please take the microphone. Could we pass the microphone?
Well, when it comes to long-range policy, I think that it's up to the Council of...
Microphone, turn it on.
Is that on? Yeah, it is.
Okay.
It's up to the newly established Research and Development Council. But this has to do with... The first step should be done, and I think that they are doing it now, is to collect data. There's no data on what we have now. And based on that data, they should oversee what's going on and perhaps recommend new direction and so forth. But on the operational level, I don't think that any government office should tell or should put pressure on researchers in the universities or even the industry and tell them what's important, what's less important. I think that the current model, by the way, is pretty good. I mean, when you go to the chief scientist, the chief scientist policy is not to tell the industry what to do, but at least when it comes to cooperation between industry and the academia, he waits for proposal from the industry that involves the universities, and if he likes it, he supports it. And the second approach is what Tellem is doing. I mean, you can affect general direction by supplying R&D infrastructure. There's an old saying, there's a saying which I've heard in England, by the way, that if you want to influence, if you want bees to take their hives somewhere else, you don't order them. You simply put some honey in the place that you want them to go. And this is the whole idea with supporting important infrastructure. So clearly, if the government supports a big infrastructure in nanotechnology, something will happen, both in the industry and in the research level, because if the facilities are there, more and more scientists in basic research, so-called basic research, will be tempted to use the facilities and do something which fits the facilities. But I'm against a more direct approach where the government decides to put money in research and research contracts. Facilities, yes. Deciding which research is better or not, It's bad. It's up to the universities and the industries to pop up ideas and ask for support if they can convince the government that they are worthwhile.
So?
Too long, I'm sorry.
Not at all.
Okay, I think 2 points. One is that I think that we should put more money into research in the universities, by the way, in the industry as well, but now we're talking in academia, so in academia. I'm kind of afraid of deciding on priorities, on directions, because take myself as an example. 15 years ago, I decided that biotech is the best thing to do in Israel. 7 years ago, I decided it's the worst thing to do in Israel. Was I right 15 years ago? Am I right now? Nobody, I don't know. Now, I know something about technology. Think about it, what happens when somebody in the government makes that decision. And at least there was one chief scientist, by the way, many years ago, that decided that robotics is the best thing to invest. And he took all the money of the chief scientist, kind of 95% of it, and put it into a robotics company. How many robotics companies do we have now in Israel? So, put more money, but let the industry or the academia decide on the way.
Thank you. I have a question to Professor Murray, but to all the panelists as well. And I'll phrase it provocatively, because this is a point that I think hurts me a lot. I come from the university, 40 years in a university environment. Universities are struggling today in Israel. Their budgets are being cut. Donations are falling. Tuition, they can't raise tuition for political reasons. So all universities have big holes in their pockets. One of the responses has been the goose that lays the golden egg approach. The golden egg is university research and patents. And the idea is to grab onto the IP created in universities ever more tightly in order to fill the hole in their pockets that comes from falling revenues. The result is the opposite. The geese don't lay golden eggs. They don't lay at all. Because venture capitalists who find that universities have an interest in patents run a million miles away because universities tend to be obstructed. Question. Based on your experience at MIT and so on, how do we persuade universities that it's in the national interest to create knowledge and give it away rather than to try and appropriate it and, in fact, hurt their own interest, not just the national interest?
So I think that's a leading question, which is fine. I mean, I think that the evidence is, in a sense, speaks for itself, right? So if you look at places like MIT, if you look at the American example, the universities that have done the best increasingly are those that have allowed the ideas not to walk out of the door completely unencumbered, but to walk out of the door with relatively few provisions associated with them. And I think the data also show that even on a scale that's so much bigger than the scale here, the university is never going to be able to fill that hole. So MIT also has a hole in its pocket because donations are down, the endowment has collapsed for all the reasons that we know. I think the university understands that we can't fill it by trying to up the licensing revenue because, as I said before, you take 100 licenses, one of them makes you money, and you don't know in advance which one that's going to be, and the more you add strictures, the worse that is. And I think that, as I say, you would like to believe that in a university data would speak and that people would actually look at the evidence and think about it accordingly. I think the higher administration in the university can see that. And the government has to understand also that this is not the solution. I think in the UK there are some very similar problems. It's taken some persuasion to try to convince universities. I think the academics understand, and if you show them the data, it's very clear this is not the way to make your fortune. It's the way in which the licensing officers are rewarded that's the problem. And I think you have to solve it that way and start to say, we want the universities to have long-term impact and recognize this is a long-term problem, and that you have to put more money into basic research. I agree that the government can't decide on each and every project. I think that the word autonomy, which you mentioned earlier on, is very important.
at the level of which particular research project, it has to be done on an excellence basis. I think that the national academies, councils on competitiveness can shape direction and have a voice, but the government can't be choosing each and every project. I think that's a fundamentally flawed idea.
Okay, thank you. Just for interest, how many of you here in the audience are entrepreneurs already or hope to be, plan to be entrepreneurs in the future? Raise your hand. Wow. Excellent. Everybody's an entrepreneur. You people are our future. Questions, please, for our panelists. Yes. Could we bring the microphone? Please quickly pass it over. Tell us who you are.
Okay, my name is Yael, and I'm from BioPetroclean, which is a startup in the bio clean tech energy section. So from hearing these lectures, actually, I got the impression that the university went in the path of, having a lot of IPs. But I think the problem is not doing enough looking what is the need. So what happened is that you have a lot of IPs that doesn't mean anything. And what happened in our company, and I guess in any other VCs, is there is a very impressive professor maybe that speaks highly about the technology, but he has no idea what the market is. And then VC puts millions of dollars, which is private money, for actually something that doesn't meet the market. And maybe this is the issue. The issue is not that we run from the university because they're, okay, maybe we run from the university because they're out there in the space. And even when trying to be connected to the ground by making IP is actually not the way.
Panelists? Simon, do you want to respond to this one?
I'm not sure what the question is, but...
How do we get university professors to have more awareness of market needs to develop things that are more related to marketplace?
Well, I mean, getting back to the first two questions and then relating to this one, I think we are all very confused. I mean, in a way, and the way Zohar put it is the best one. We just don't know because we don't even know if in the long range capitalism works. I mean, it sounds like a very philosophical statement, but if you think about it and think on the way the world is changing over the last year and a half, 2 years, we have basic questions on this relationship between what government does as a government and what business does as a business, and whether the model that we all admire and like, and of course, being on the successful side of entrepreneurs, at least in some cases, I love this model. I mean, I enjoy it very much. But the question on what government should do in universities, I believe, is part of a much broader question on this, whether this model that we live with really will work in the long range. From my personal experience, all I can say is, I've been blessed by getting my bachelor's degree in the Technion I believe it was 1967, quite a few years ago, and working and studying in an institute which had, by the way, I think at that time, the same number of staff members as it has today, 42 years later. I'm not sure about the number of students. And the real main thing was the excellence of and the spirit of being. I remember in those days my professor saying we need to compete with MIT. There was no MIT forum at that time, and I didn't know what MIT was, so it didn't impress me too much. So I think the main point that I'm trying to make, referring to these two questions and the last one, is I think the most important part is really promoting excellence. You cannot do it without putting money into it. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are allowed at a certain department to get 2 new staff members and you have 5 that retire, you add it up over 20 years and you find out, and again, this is a department, I know that the physics department in the Technion has less staff members now than it had in 1967. And then the end result of that, no matter what you do with research, is degradation in the quality of students that you get out of that. And that, you know, is going to impact us 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road in what we can do. On this whole IP thing with universities and these technology transfer offices that they have, I think their things are basically wrong, because in a way we have the wrong people trying to play roles in the wrong places because of the way, and I think it was mentioned here in the sense of how are they rewarded. I mean, who decides if they did a good job or a bad job in what they do? And I think that creates lots of distortion. The worst thing I would think about is to have these technology transfer offices go to professors and say, I would like you to write a patent on this because there is a great economical future in it. Because, you know, as Zohar pointed out, you know, he is not so bad in technology, and he didn't know why he did what he did 15 years ago. He didn't know why he did it 7 years ago, and he still doesn't know, you know, what he's doing. And don't take it personally. I mean, this is the way these things evolve. So this is a very long answer to a question that I didn't fully understand, but I'm saying this whole notion of let's organize it, let's put order into it, so the professors and the PhD students and everybody knows what to do in order to create I don't know what wealth in the long range for everybody. I don't think this really works.
Elad passed me a note and mentioned that Professor...
Can I make just a quick comment about that?
Yes,
I
I'm sorry.
think that, I think that there's a... So I think we have to be very, very careful, and I agree with your comments about the idea that we're going to come in and tell every professor this is what you're going to do because we think it's useful, not only because the whole notion of a university is about the autonomy that individuals have and select to engage in that environment, but also because we don't know, right? And so I think what we have to do is have people do excellent science and technology and hope that that's guided by a sense of what might be useful in the long run. And then we have to let faculty do what they do best, which is do technical kind of experiments and really do leading edge research. And then I think that the other part of this is the market experiment. You have to experiment with what works in the market and what there's need for, and that changes over time. And that has to be done outside the university. I mean, I think that we know that faculty members are probably some of the worst business people. I mean, you know, Biogen is a nice example in Boston, right, started by Wally Gilbert. He subsequently won 2 Nobel Prizes, but he was fired by his board because he was a terrible CEO. I mean, he wanted to do everything. And so we know that faculty members, the quicker you get the idea out there and allow the market experiments to work in the hands of investors and entrepreneurs who understand how to do that, the better. And so I think while it's frustrating, having the faculty in the right role, which is more of a technical advisory role, and letting the market kind of operate quickly and with capital efficiency is probably what you want to do, not to put a heavy hand into the university.
Thank you. Elad passed me a note and mentioned that Professor Gazit is here. Professor Gazit, would you like to join us? We've said a lot. Your title is Vice President for R&D for Tel Aviv University. We've said a lot of critical things about people in your job.
Okay.
Would you like to tell us about how you do your job and perhaps rebut?
Okay. So the first time I gave a presentation to MIT Forum, I was still just a professor, and Ella introduced me as an entrepreneur, and indeed, I see myself first of all as a professor and a scientist, but also as an inventor and as the vision of entrepreneur. But now I have the official position of the chairman of Ramot. This is our technology transfer company. I think that the basis for innovation is truly in universities. It is true that, and we see it very well in the American experience. This example of Biogen is indeed true, and I always recommend scientists to be at the first stage when you need to really to have the know-how, but then to move on and let the business people to make those to make the decisions that are more related to business development rather than innovation. I have to protect the academic system. I truly think that in many cases, academic system in Israel, as well as of course in other countries and mainly in the United States, is the prime basis for innovation. By professors themselves with patents and intellectual properties that is being developed, but also as the place in which we educate people in the industry will become inventor or will become leading innovators in the industry, and this is very important. And I disagree sometimes with, especially with Zohar Zisappel on the way that we should develop academic knowledge. But I do think, and we have few examples in Israel for technology that came out of academic institutions and became important for Israeli economy. I think the best one is Copaxone from the Weizmann Institute. But there are many more in the pipeline, and I'm certain that in the next years we will see more and more technology from the universities that will affect Israeli economy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me remind you that the topic is success factors. One of the success factors is, of course, powerful basic science, but there are many others. Questions from the audience? Yes? Microphone. Can we get the microphone over here? Thank you. No? Turn it on?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, my name is Rina Levy, and I'm an Israeli who returned from the United States. I recently worked at a company called Midra Corporation, which has started as MIT Research. And the reason why I'm mentioning it because we talked today about the lack of funding and the decay of the Israeli university industries and the need for more money for us to be more productive. And I want to tell you about the model that we worked. The Midra Corporation is a not-for-profit organization, does research and consulting for the U.S. government. And it's a non-for-profit organization, just like a university, but it's a very rich organization. And the reason why that company has done very well is because for every industry project that company does, and it has about 8,000 employees and over $1 billion dollars in revenue, we used to, I'm not there anymore, I'm here in Israel, we charged between 3 and 5% research fee. And that was very acceptable by all our clients. So I'm offering suggestions for some revival of the industry, Israeli universities, to connect research to the industry, that perhaps you guys who have a lot of influence on Israeli government and Vadot and all kinds of other places, that you might want to suggest some kind of a model. There are a lot of people, a lot of companies here, especially in the IT industry, which I belong to, make a lot of money and do a lot of consulting. Why won't they contribute to the universities?
Panel? Anyone? Professor Ziv? Wait, microphone.
There are different phases to the IP issue in the university. First of all, there's a big difference between IT and biomed, because when it comes to biomed, it's natural that in order to move a project, a research project in that, you need big groups and so forth. In IT, sometimes the idea lies in the crazy head of one faculty member, and the time constant between a new idea and its applicativity is not more than 3 or 4 years, or else it's worthless. So, secondly, at least when it comes to the IT area, which I am more familiar with, the times where a professor was an isolated guy with a white coat, with holes made out by acid and so forth in an isolated basement are gone. I mean, young faculty members know exactly what ideas they have. They have a very good feeling, unlike perhaps in biomed, what the industry needs. And what we need is not to prevent them from getting, from establishing consulting relation with the industry. This is something that they really want. And sometimes we cannot hire new faculty members if we don't assure them that the universities will allow them to do consulting with the industry. So this is the third aspect of IP. So right now, because of the old IP model, I must say, and I know that some people don't agree with me here, in the universities, because of the IP model, which is not like the one which was introduced by Fioria, and is that when a faculty member is approached by the industry and they want him to consult on a specific problem, he cannot do it without first having the company sign an agreement with the university that every IP which will be generated during the consulting process, not in the university, will somehow benefit the university itself. This is a big stumbling block which prevents and discourages young, at least very young faculty members to do consulting with the industry, and that's bad, of course. Secondly, it prevents many young and bright potential faculty members to try and join a university, even if they want to do research, because the other aspect, that of consulting, is very important to them, and rightly so. So this is something which should be solved, and as I have said, most universities in Israel, including the institute that I'm very proud of, the Technion, I mean, doesn't allow right now, and this should be changed, and this is part of the recommendation of the committee that Zohar and myself were in, which were, as you heard, adopted in principle. So now, the issue of what kinds of returns the faculty member gets for an invention which was done within the university, this varies. I mean, this is a big issue. If the university invested a lot of money, especially when it comes to biomed and so forth, they should get part of the share. But then there's a question of who does the commercialization of the invention. And I don't believe that the university can do it well. Think of a simple thing. I mean, if you want to hire a good patent lawyer, I mean, how much a university is allowed to pay him? They are not allowed to pay him much. And of course, what you get is either you don't get anybody at all, or you get somebody that you'll better not have. So, but this is the second issue. I'm saying that the real crucial issue right now, at least in the IT area, is to encourage faculty members to consult. And this is the number one issue right now.
I want to relate to the IP in the university. In my opinion, to put it simply, all the IP should be given away, not given away, given to the researcher. The researcher should be able to do whatever he wants with it, he, she, as long as he does it in Israel. And it is very simple. I mean, where does the money for the university research come from? It all comes from taxpayers' money. So this is our money. This should go back to the community, and it goes back best by establishing companies, making jobs, etc. Now, if you do that, it will open such a flow of knowledge coming from the university into industry, into commerce, into everywhere. Now, I'm not worried too much about, first of all, the professor would find the right business people. The business people will come to them, don't worry. There is money needed to write patents, but this is small money. It could be given by the government, by the way, to any professor who wants to write a patent. He should get a lawyer that would write a patent for him. That's not a problem. It's such a small minute money anyway. Now, the only thing I would do is that if that IP is being sold abroad, then very simply by the same logic, 90% of it goes back to the government. I wouldn't take it to the government. I would give it back to Vatat and then spread it around the university. Through that, give it back as research money. Okay? Now, nowadays, every university is building its own commercial arm. And if you talk with researchers, they will tell you that they hate them and they are impotent, etc. They will use words that you wouldn't be able to use here. If you talk with the business people, they will tell you the same.
About the professors.
No, about the commercial people. No, about the commercial arm of the university. If you talk, and the end of the day, there is not too much university IP being used by industry. Okay, so we all lose, if you want. Now, I think that's the way we should push it, and if we do that, I mean, and this is, by the way, the MIT way. I'm just taking it a little bit further with doing it free all the way. But think about what is free. It's ours. And who is the university? The university are the researchers.
Zohar, let's do some research here. How many of you agree with Zohar's suggestion, that patents should be vested to the university researcher that developed the research? How many of you agree? Raise your hand. How many of you think this is not a good idea? Ehud. Ehud decides. So.
No, I must say that Zohar is very articulated, and if I can comment on this, you would never have Doxil, you would never have Copaxone under this. It's a big difference between IT and between biomed, and you should understand it. Most of the activities of the commercialization arms of the university are related to biomed research, which is completely different.
Well, there is only one Copaxone, and we keep on mentioning it. And it ended up going to one university, and the others are, and it's not Tel Aviv University, by the way, unfortunately.
There are many others. I mean, it's...
Okay.
I'd like to make a comment, because I think we have a serious problem with how much money, in simple terms, goes to academia in Israel from the point of view of how we build up things in the long range. I don't think, and I'm less familiar with what's going on these days with IT. I kind of knew a little bit more about it the way it used to be 10 or 20 years ago. I'm much more familiar with what's going on with medical devices. And I can tell you that we have no lack whatsoever of ideas, patents, IP, whatever you want to call it. I mean, the number is far larger than what Israel can support in terms of how much talent you can get to each of those initiatives. And I think we have a serious, excuse me for the expression, screw-up in our wonderful model, which really works but doesn't, of the government support that is given through the chief scientist to start things where typically what any initiative can get is around $500,000, but then when it needs to go to the next step, there's not enough money around. But even worse than that, there are not enough people around that can support, and my estimate is something like 1,000 startups just in the area of medical devices. So I don't think, we need to encourage people in the university to develop IP. I think they do it on their own to a large extent because of the point that was raised before, where we said everybody in this country is an entrepreneur, and that includes university professors. And by the way, a large portion of that are the past successes that we have. And Copaxone is, of course, the example that everybody wants to quote. But there are many others, and there are many others, of course, in the area of IT and communication and so on and so forth. So I don't think we lack anything there. I think that what we lack is building up, high level, or keeping the high level of universities and academia and university research that we had 20 years ago, that is deteriorating all the time because, there's not really enough money to get excellent people into the university. Now, once you have them and they do research, there will be IP generated. I don't think we need to encourage them or say to them, why don't you invent something? Because I see it all the time. I see it more, by the way, in a system which is somewhat parallel, which is the medical system in Israel, of hospitals and the various insurance companies that employ a large number of MDs, and they generate more IP than we can handle. I don't think there's any lack of that. What is really missing is the ability to sort it out properly and to really focus on some areas or some companies that can generate lots of value. But there is no lack of innovation and no lack of new IP being generated.
Could we get the microphone to this gentleman? And while we're doing that, a quick comment about Copaxone. Copaxone is a copolymer. It's a very large, complicated molecule. It's not a typical drug pharmaceutical molecule. Producing it to exact requirements, and so that each dose is exactly the same, was a hugely difficult task. It was done by Teva. So a large part of the success of Copaxone is not the basic research only. It's a powerful partnership with a powerful company with very excellent production capabilities, and such as Teva. Please.
Hi, my name is Arnon Gat, and I am one of those lucky students that at their earlier time was able to take an idea from university, commercialize it, and start a commercial company, and hopefully successful at the time. And I did have quite a bit of trouble with the commercialization institute at Stanford. Maybe MIT is better, but Stanford was sort of tough. But my question really doesn't relate to that. We all think about invention as somebody gets up in the morning, gets a whack on the head, and comes up with the idea, but there's a science to invention. And my first question, I have two short ones. My first question is, do we really teach in our universities the science of invention, how to invent, how to look at problems, how to solve them? I mean, just be systematic about going about the invention as opposed to kind of random walk and find new things. That's my question number one. My number two question is there enough incentives to the students and the researcher to invent and file patent as opposed to publish papers, which is usually what people are being judged at in an academic institution?
Panelists, who would like to respond? Professor Ziv?
Well, first of all, I don't think that you can teach a guy how to become an innovator. I mean, I was taking part in a very interesting workshop at Stanford last summer, held by the World Economic Fair on Innovation 100. And a good time was dedicated to the question, how do you define innovation? And I think that this reminds me of an old physical principle which says that in quantum theory, that if you try to measure a phenomena, you might kill it. And on the other hand, this doesn't mean that we cannot expose students to ideas as to how the outside world is performing. This is another thing. But how to innovate, I don't believe that it's possible to teach at all. And let me just end by one remark that I wanted to keep to the end. I must compliment myself by bringing this panel to the point where I was talking about innovation and the industrialists were pressing the fact that the budget of research in universities should be increased. This is what I do all the time, and I was very conscientious not to mention it. But it doesn't mean that this is a very crucial point, of course, as mentioned by Zohar. Thank you.
I'm not sure I should say anything now, because that seems like a very important point that you've made. And I think it is on video, so everyone is on camera of saying that. So I think it's possible to teach people how to be systematic in problem solving, how to think systematically about evidence, right? What's the hypothesis, whether it's a technical one, a commercial one, a market one. So I think that we can require our students to think clearly and to think carefully about the evidence that's presented to them and to understand what the key risks are when they're doing something technical or something more business-oriented. And something that I think that we have to do better in business schools when we teach entrepreneurship is not just tell a bunch of successful stories, which we're very good at, right? We select on the dependent variable and we simply tell success after success. We have to talk about failures and whether we think that the people who were successful were lucky or whether they had a combination of luck and good strategy. Obviously, luck is always important. And so I think that we can do that. As far as those incentives are concerned, you know, I don't know the system as well here as perhaps I should or as I'd like to understand it, but I mean, I think that if you look at the MIT example, and we don't quite put the IP in the hands of faculty, and we don't do that for the reason that we believe at the scale of our institution, there's some economies of scale associated with having an office. We don't have a commercialization office, in my opinion. We have a technology licensing office, and that's a very narrow construction. We don't actually try to build companies. We provide incentives for faculty members, entrepreneurs, and investors to build companies. That, I think, is a very important distinction. The incentives come through sharing of any economic benefits. They also come through the incentives of creating jobs for your students, creating an exciting lab that's connected to industry and to interesting problems. And they come from faculty having a variety of opportunities to participate in industry. And so I think, and the other thing is our licensing office is constructed to basically do what the professor wants with their idea. So if I, as a faculty member, do not want a patent, I can choose not to. I can choose to make my idea publicly available. I can write open source code if I want to. If I want it patented, I get to basically choose the route of commercialization. And so I think empowering faculty members to do that creates incentives, because then you can construct a lab that you want. And you also recognize, now maybe in Israel this is different, at least in the US and at MIT, we recognize that probably 80% of our patents come from less than a third of our faculty. That 2/3 of the faculty do research that's either not patentable or they don't want to do it. We don't want to make everybody an entrepreneur. I think that would be a bad idea. Now, as I say, maybe in Israel everyone's an entrepreneur and it's different. I don't think so, actually. But and the same with our students. We don't want all of them to be entrepreneurs, and nor do we want them all to be entrepreneurs the moment they walk out the door. The advice we normally give them is to do other things first and then to do entrepreneurship later. Whether it's when grey hair comes or not, I'm not sure. But and so I think that we try to give incentives, but not to require everybody to do something.
I would like to respond to your question. Can we teach people in universities, students and faculty, to be more inventive? And I've spent 40 years trying to do this, and I think there is a simple principle that would help a lot if we could simply instill it in our faculty and our students. And that is this. Israel has many startups with incredible technology-driven products that do absolute magic and that are totally useless because they meet no real market need. The principle here has to be involved in society. Get out of the ivory tower. We don't have a moral right to be in an ivory tower anymore. We're using public money and it's getting scarcer. Get into society. Be involved with society. Figure out what the main issues are. What are the big problems? And then go back and try and use your knowledge, your technology, to solve real problems. It sounds so simple. But we people in universities, we are so isolated very often from what's really going on in society, we don't even know what the questions are. Paul Samuelson, the late Paul Samuelson, passed away two weeks ago. Amazing man, the greatest economist of his generation from MIT. He said, good questions are far better than easy answers. And I think a lot could be done to improve innovativeness in universities if we simply help people to ask better questions, ask good questions. What's on the national agenda? And then step up and try and solve them, even if it's difficult. Do we have time for one last question, Ela? Yes. Who will take the last question? Way in the back. You got it. Could we get the microphone back there? Thank you.
I need to defend the most hated, I think, part in this room. My name is Tamar Raz. I'm from Ramot, the technology transfer company of Tel Aviv University. And I have to say that we realize that we are the party that everybody likes to hate. And the reason for it is that we do the toughest job because we are really in the eye of the storm. And I'm sure everybody realizes that there are here two totally opposite cultures that are trying to talk with each other. And these are the researchers of the university from one hand and the industry from the other hand. And each one is talking a different language. And I'm sure you industry people realize it. I think that the professors in the universities sometimes realize it less. And our job is to do the connection. And I think that part of the job we do very well, part of the job probably less. And just to give you an example, and it's from the really biotech section, so maybe it's not the relevant for IT or high-tech industries, but out of Tel Aviv University in the last 4 years came out 6 new ideas for new drugs for Alzheimer's disease. All of them are out there in the market being developed, few by startups, few by bigger companies, 2 in Israel, 4 in United States and Europe. They might all fail in the future, we don't know. But this is our job, to take the technologies out from the university, give them to companies, and let them do the job. Definitely we are not trying to be the business people, we are trying to do the commercialization, to take it out, or the technology transfer, to take it out from the university into the industry. And regarding the IP question, I have 2 remarks. Most of these technologies were able to go out from the university after we have invested few tens of $1,000s on each IP with the best IP people or the best IP attorneys in Israel or from the United States. I doubt if the IP was given to the professors at the first stage, it will even come to this stage. Most of them will not do this, but the IP will get lost. And I have one example from Italy that I think till 3 years ago, the law in Italy was that the IP was not of the universities and of the professors. And I think the statistics there was very bad, that there was the amount of IP that was generated from universities and going out to the industry was very, very low. I say 3 years ago because I don't know the statistics or what's the situation at the moment. And one last remark to Zohar, I'm not sure if we do not need to see the university as the employer of the professors. And I'm sure that in every high-tech company, if an employee is having an IP or an idea, it belongs to the company. So it might be that within the university, it should really belong to the university. And of course, the professors need to have their share, and I think that the universities in Israel are very, very generous. And if somebody doesn't know, from every dollar that the university does from commercialization, 40% go to the inventors. Not to the university, not to the research, but to the inventors themselves. So I think this is quite a good incentive for the professors.
Good rebuttal. I think I need to summarize so that we can take a coffee break. Let me use a metaphor that Professor Murray used, the ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem. So Israel has a complex ecology of innovation, and it includes startups, basic research, universities, VCs, funding, government, industry, and the ecosystem is like the Olympic 110-meter hurdles. In order to succeed, you have to successfully leap over each of those hurdles. And there are a lot more than 10 in becoming a successful startup. In other words, this complicated ecology, every part of it has to work and has to work well. And if parts of it don't work well, then we lose a lot as a nation. And I think we are agreed that there are parts of our innovation ecosystem that aren't working well. I'm not sure that we agree about how to fix it, but at least we had a fruitful discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists very, very much for an interesting discussion. And now you're about to take part in a MIT Enterprise Forum tradition. We have very long coffee breaks. You have 45 minutes for coffee. Please come back at 6:45. This is purposeful, right, Fiona? The idea is for you to network and to discuss things. And one last task. Thanks for reminding me, Fiona. Come a very long way to give us this talk. We appreciate it. Thanks for enlightening us. Thank you very much. Enjoy our coffee break.